Louise Knight, it is a pleasure to meet you here today, and I want to thank you right off the bat for your book, Jane Addams. It's a fantastic book, and it seems like such a timely moment to be discussing it when the United Nations just yesterday appointed Michelle Bachelet to head the new women's agency. Since that's where you end the book, I thought you might want to start our conversation by just thinking about the timeliness of your own project and the work of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Yeah, thank you for putting it that way, because I very much perceive the appointment of this new head of a women's agency at the UN, which is, of course, a consolidation of the various agencies that have been looking out for women into one solid, more stronger group, as a real continuation of the work of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which Addams co-founded along with many other women in 1915. And their vision at that time was completely radical, and now look at what the UN has. The vision was that women should be part of the peace negotiation process. They should be, of course, they should be diplomats representing their nations in negotiation, but also that women in time of war are at special risk for rape, that their children are at special risk for dying under refugee conditions. And all of these things are the purview of the new women's agency. The other piece to be said right away is that it's the 10th anniversary of the UN Security Resolution 1325, which was adopted in October of 2000. And that resolution has not exactly been very fulfilled as yet. And now that there's a women's agency in the UN with a high-ranking person heading it, the chances are much greater that that person is going to look out for implementation of 1325, which is focused specifically on whether women are part of the peace negotiating process and whether women's risks during and after war are being protected.
So the committee, when it was first, the League, when it was first a committee, was a committee for permanent peace. How do you see that question of permanence, both in terms of Jane Addams' work and life project, and also in terms of the work that you're doing by actually writing the book?
Actually, well, that's a nice way to open up an interesting topic. Jane Addams wrote a book near the end of her life called "The Excellent Becomes the Permanent." And it's kind of an interesting title, puzzling to many unless they're familiar with Plato, who, of course, this is where she took the phrase from, believed that the truly excellent were ipso facto permanent. And Addams' book was a memoir of people who she cherished. They were speeches that she gave, it isn't a memoir exactly, it's a collection of speeches she gave at their memorial services. And so she was, in each case, doing her best to evoke their excellence at the memorial service and then between the covers of a book so that they would not be forgotten. And I think that that's the first thing to say about what permanence meant to her. And obviously, in writing the book, I couldn't help but feel like I was also contributing to that same project. In my case, I was trying to create and ensure her excellence by capturing it between the covers of a book. At the same time, as a biographer, my job is not just to record excellence, because the biographer's job is to capture the humanity of a person. And humanity obviously means the side of them where they have compassion, of course, but also the side of them that is flawed, because we all bear that burden of being imperfect. And so I needed to do that as well. But in a way, I mean, that's the biographer's definition of excellence, is to capture the complete humanity of a person. To go to your question about the International Committee for Women, what was the right title?
It was the International Committee for Permanent Peace.
International Committee of Women for Permanent Peace, right.
Women's Peace Party is much easier.
Yeah, that title was, of course, the creation of a group of women who got together in 1915 in April. The World War I had not been underway even a year, and they were meeting in The Hague, which is a symbol of international peace efforts, even and was then, to try and decide what they could possibly do about this bloody and devastating war. And the women who showed up at the meeting came from both sides of the warring nations. So that was in itself remarkable. And of course, they crossed dangerous waters or dangerous borders to get there. And I think when they used the word permanent peace, what they meant was, we want to put forward to the world, and they did in a platform, the concepts that we think are going to ensure that we don't have another war. But if we don't do these things that we are laying out, we will have another war. And so that platform was a very, they have not gotten the credit they deserve for the remarkable content of that platform. And if you compare it to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, you see how remarkable it was, especially because the other peace platforms that preceded it from the male-dominated peace societies were very incomplete. And theirs was quite complete and had many of the elements that Wilson's 14 points had. So I think that's what they meant by permanent peace.
That's fascinating. In terms of the ways that permanent peace operates in her life story, as you tell it, there's also that religious part, because her story is so filled with the anguish from early childhood to the very end of losing parents, of losing her mother, of then losing her father, of losing siblings, of losing her friends just after she gets the Nobel Peace Prize. That question of how that part of peace operated throughout her life is something to just wonder about, especially as you tell the story, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I gather you're sort of implying what's the relationship between peace and death?
For her.
For her. And that is, I think, the right way to frame it. I think they were very connected. And obviously they are for all the rest of us too, in the sense that the time when a society is most aware of death is when it's at war. Death is on the TV every night. The names of the dead are scrolling by. And for Addams, I'm certain that her passion for peace was built in part on the trauma that death was for her, beginning at age 2 when her stepmother died. And then her father died when she was 21. And in between, her sister died when she was 6. And she was traumatized by death because it came so young, and because she had a big mind, you know, so she really was wrestling with the meaning of death the rest of her life. And I think the idea that a government, which in her mind was supposed to be a nurturer of the people's self-development, would authorize death it didn't fit together.
Right. And at the same time, there's a kind of, before the word came around, there's a kind of existential drama being played out throughout her life, right? Because you have her as an extremely not only learned woman, but also a kind of bookish woman, a woman who derives a great deal from literature, from the arts. And yet again and again and again, she discovers that she doesn't know what she's talking about. She discovers that she needs to experience it to have, when it comes to lynching, when it comes to whatever, that she really needs to think about what the base of knowledge is. I'm wondering what it's like to be a biographer who writes about a person who has great faith in words that you are writing, but at the same time says, but there are limits to that. I mean, your own relationship to Jane Addams, now in 2 books, right?
Yeah, it definitely was something I thought a lot about. I'm a bookish person. You know, I love learning from books, and obviously to write a biography, I was learning from a lot of books and a lot of letters and speeches and things. And it has really forced me to think more about how well I've diversified my own means of learning. And I can't ignore the fact that I need to diversify my sources. I need to have more experience. I mean, I've had certain kinds of experiences from work, some volunteer work, etc. So I have a sense of the potential. Actually, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and I tutored an African-American woman who was in jail for drugs, theft, whatever. And that was an eye-opening experience for me, even though she was very careful, of course, to not be too revealing. But I got a sense of some of the things that happened in her life. And it was very sobering for me to be meeting a person frequently whose life was so different from mine. And that's what Jane Addams's point was and is about why you need to live in a settlement house or why you need to make sure your life isn't structured in a very narrow path where you only have contact with people from your own class, your own background, and that you aren't even aware of how ignorant you are.